out your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to CN Live, Season 6, Episode 15, Nuked. I'm Joe Lauria, the Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
In September 2021, the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia announced a joint project to build 8 nuclear submarines for Australia at a cost of $368 billion Australian dollars. To conclude the deal, Australia had to scrap an already concluded agreement with France to build 12 conventional submarines for the Royal Australian Navy at 50 billion Australian dollars. France, which had been strung along by Australia until just before AUKUS was announced, was furious.
The deceit was intentional. And because there was far more at stake than providing submarines, the way it was handled was plainly a stab in the back.
The Anglo-Saxon deal has dangerous overtones for the Pacific region as it ramps up unnecessary tension with China, Australia's largest trading partner. A new book called Nuked, The Submarine Fiasco that Sank Australia's Sovereignty, by our guest today, journalist Andrew Fowler, is a tale of treachery, deception, and dominance as Australia's sovereignty is undermined amidst manufactured tensions with China. The subservience of the Anthony Albanese government to the United States in its continuation of the AUKUS project begun by the previous Prime Minister, Scott Morrison.
That fell down under.
In which Australia will fork out billions of dollars for the submarines it does not need in order to protect itself from an enemy it does not have, is at the core of Fowler's book. Nuked, The Submarine Fiasco that Sank Australia's Sovereignty is published by Melbourne University Press. The book won a Walkley Award this year for its author, who joins us tonight.
Andrew is an award-winning investigative journalist and a former reporter for the ABC's Foreign Correspondent and Four Corners programs. Fowler began his journalism career in the early 1970s, covering the IRA bombing campaign for the London Evening News. He has been the chief of staff and acting foreign editor of the Australian newspaper. He wrote The Most Dangerous Man in the World, the story of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks in 2011, which was updated in 2012 and 2020. Fowler first interviewed Assange for Foreign Correspondent in 2010, for which the program won the New York Festival Gold Medal. His two other books are The War on Journalism and Shooting the Messenger, Criminalizing Journalism. Fowler is a winner of the United Nations Peace Prize, has lectured on journalism at universities in Australia and the UK, and has contributed to various academic papers.
Andrew, welcome back to CN Live.
Thanks, Jeff.
I suspect when you first saw the headlines about this story, you saw a book in it.
Well, when I first saw the headlines, or when I first realized that the three leaders of the, or three of the Five Eyes leaders were going to have a morning press conference, I thought, well, this is going to be one of Scott Morrison's sort of marketing exercises. And, I was rather surprised that there was a lot more in it than I initially believed. But what got me interested in really doing the story and doing the book investigation was the failure of transparency and the spending of such a vast amount of public money, $368 billion, and that's just the minimum.
Were you surprised that there weren't several writers trying to do the same story?
Well, I was surprised that, that for a start, Joe, but also I was surprised that during the run-up to this, as you look at the history, nobody was really pushing back against the government in all of the scare campaigns that were being run about China. The whole idea that somehow the Chinese were about to land on the beaches of Broome and start taking over towns. It was as though we were almost at war with China. We were expecting all the sort of ramp-up stuff that was going on. Which I think Chomsky called manufacturing consent, and that's exactly what was happening, as we now realize with the announcement of this project. But what again was really surprising was that, despite the grandness of the opening of the announcement, there was so few detail in it. In fact, there was nothing behind it at all. It was just a PR announcement, and there's no guarantee that Australia will actually get the submarines that were so announced. In fact, we've got that rather large gap in our defence capabilities because of the failure of the government to nail down the fact that we actually, having ditched the French, have no guarantee we're going to get anything to replace the submarine program.
You've scoured, obviously, the press in Australia, the United States, and Britain. And has anyone done any serious reporting about this story in terms of, as you say, really digging down for the details and challenging any of this, why it happened? This
No.
massive, huge outlay. No. The answer is no.
No, the answer is no. And when Melbourne University Press published the book, we sent out copies to different people, different journalists, and one of them from a very important broadcaster, when I called that person and said, look, sent you the book, and I sent a list of stories that were in the book, and I've been doing journalism for a number of years, so I kind of recognize what a good story is. And they said, oh, well, I'll read it in a couple of weeks. I mean, seriously, I'll read it in a couple of weeks. And the only paper that really picked it up with any real urgency was The Guardian, which did run a story on it. And but I would have thought the national broadcaster might have been more interested. And
Was that The Guardian UK or?
It was The Guardian. I mean, look, programs like Late Night Live, that's current affairs discussion program, and some of the regional programs picked up interviews with me, and there was some interest, but not in the news. I mean, the news is the thing you got to hit through to get people interested in what's going on in their country, and it was covered more like current affairs rather than it was about a hard-edged problem that Australia faced.
I suspect that there's a big audience for your book because I think many Australians wanted answers and the press failed them. But let's get into the story itself now. If you can give us a broad overview. How did we go from Turnbull calling up Hollande and telling him that France had beat Germany and Japan out to build these submarines, these conventional submarines for Australia? And how did we get to where we are today? Could you give us a broad overview of this story, please?
Well, how we got to that position, Joe, is that Tony Abbott, when he was Prime Minister, wanted to go with the Japanese because the Japanese were the preferred option for the United States. Now, what happened is that the South Australians were unhappy with that because they make submarines in South Australia, and the Japanese were not going to make them in South Australia. So, before he was booted out of office, Abbott set up what was known as a competitive evaluation program, and basically they set up, an idea of like an exam question: what do we need from these submarines? And they came up with three in the end, as you just mentioned: the Germans, the Japanese, and the French. Eventually, the French were selected by a country mile, I'm told, by people that were involved in the program. It won absolutely hands down. But the problem with the French were that they weren't Americans. And the problem was that the Americans could not make non-nuclear submarines. They made nuclear submarines. So part of this switch involves the fealty to the United States. It's the reason why we went nuclear in one way. It's a multi-leveled sort of argument. One of the reasons why we went nuclear is because if we're going to go with the Americans, we can't go non-nuclear. The French are dumped, and we end up promising to pay the Americans and the British because we take the American submarines first as an interim, and then we take the British later on. We're going to pay them. Already paid them $10 billion together. We're going to pay them another $358 billion for a machine that's no better and much more difficult to run than the French submarines that will give you 4 more submarines and the same kind of capability. And some would say they're better than the nuclear submarines. So that's how we got to where we are.
But how did it happen that the French deal was ditched? And what was Morrison's role? How was he deceptive? Did he string the French along, didn't he?
Well, what happened was that the submarines were dumped on the pretext that they didn't meet the requirements of Scott Morrison. And if you read the book, you'll see that the actual the unraveling of that deception and of that lie is quite clear in what he told Macron. He repeatedly told Macron everything was okay, a little bit of problems, might be a few problems here and there, and then deceived him by not telling him that they were going to dump the French submarines, just said that there were some problems that needed sorting out. The French sent somebody to Australia, they looked at it, there were no real problems, they went back again. And this was all a ruse just to get rid of the French and go with the Americans. And in fact, the whole, if you want to go back to actually understanding like the overarching story of this, it's to do with people who are now head of the Australian National Defence Organisations, one of them in particular, Andrew Shearer, who is the Director of National Intelligence in Australia. And he's what they might call a right-wing hawk, and very much pro-American, was appalled when France won the deal. He's a guy who sort of bounces in and out of the Liberal governments as they come and go in power and makes his way up the ladder. He's very, very influential. He said that the French submarines were a missed opportunity for Australia because they didn't have, the French that is, any real strategic interest with Australia in the Indo-Pacific, which completely misses the point that the French have got 2 million citizens and a whole raft of countries right across the Indo-Pacific. But it suits the argument that pushes away the French. So this is both pushing the French away and moving to the United States. This guy, Andrew Shearer, spent a long time in Washington talking to Kurt Campbell. He was sent there by Morrison, in and out of the Eisenhower building a number of times. You can see it on the presidential log. And he was the go-to man in this case to actually fix up this submarine deal for Morrison and to draw Australia closer to the United States.
Well, why was it necessary to deceive the French? Was there a possibility that the AUKUS deal would have fallen through? That they had to keep that going until those actual other pieces were in place?
Well, look, the argument that Morrison puts up, which is he says that if the French had known, then they would have told the Americans, and the Americans would have then backed out because they'd have been so cowed by the French. They would have been, oh my God, we can't do this. This is a complete and utter palpable nonsense. The Americans were absolutely hand in glove with the Australians in deceiving the French. I know this because I've spoken to many people in the French diplomatic service. One of them, the ambassador, Philippe Etienne, he said that the day after the Australians had met Kurt Campbell, they went to see Kurt Campbell. They were actually talking like within days of each other, and they talked about the importance of the submarine project to the French and how important it was in the Indo-Pacific, how they're all working together. And the Americans said nothing. They made no comment. Now, Philippe Etienne didn't really understand the significance of them being so silent on it, but we now know that if you go back through the records, you'll see that even the president, Biden at the time, was saying that the French submarines were not suitable for purpose. So we now know that. So we've got those two things. So clearly the Americans were hand in glove with the Australians to stiff the French. So the idea somehow that if France were told about it, that they would be able to shake the Americans down and get their submarines back is an absolute nonsense. The Americans were already ready to fight that fight. They already decided what they wanted. What they wanted was to have the Australians using American submarines.
Why does Australia need submarines anyway? I mean, as Paul Keating has done such a great job explaining that China is not a threat to Australia. So that's number one. Number two, if there were to be a war, that would be instigated by the U.S. most likely, is if they want Australia to take offensive part in their plans. Or why wouldn't the U.S. defend, if it's supposed to be defensive, why couldn't U.S. submarines defend their ally, Australia? What does Australia need to have these submarines for? Is it some kind of prestige thing of Australian leaders to hold submarines?
No, I mean, it's two things, Johnny. I think it's fear. Australia's always feared being abandoned. At the same time, it's just cheap politics by Morrison. So you can play that card to say the Americans always come to our aid, but I mean, I think MacArthur made it pretty clear that the only reason the Americans would come to Australia's aid was if it was in America's interests. So that's a sort of a nonsense proposition. The reason that the Americans need Australia is because we are in fact now, a rear base to contain China and to attack China if it's perceived to be in America's interests. So whatever's in America's interests to do, and it's quite right that they would do what's in their interest, Australia will now go along. The submarines are just another part of the whole integration puzzle. So it's not just like it came roaring out of the blue. This is something that's been building for years now. So I think that that's the important thing to understand. If the Americans go to war, they go to war with, well, they will be American submarines. We can't operate them. Australia cannot operate the submarines that they'll take from the United States. That's if they get the submarines in the first place. They can't operate them because we haven't got the crews. These things are twice the size of the existing Collins-class submarines, twice the size, and we can't even get the crews to run them. On top of that, they need to be nuclear-capable people on board here. We don't have enough of those people. So it's just it's an addition to America, which Australia is actually paying for. So we're paying for American submarines, and they can't build enough for themselves. And as Kurt Campbell said, it doesn't matter if we give them to Australia because they'll be ours anyway. They won't be lost to America, is what he said.
Elizabeth.
So I wanted to start off by asking about the damage to Australian interests by dumping the French deal, including what you go into in the book about the loss of Australian jobs and, you know, the problems of disposal of nuclear waste and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, well, the jobs seem to have disappeared off the edge of the planet. We talked about Australian jobs at Osborne. We talked about Australian jobs. Well, there certainly are some at Stirling. You know, as the Americans, that is, build a base to basically attack the Chinese oil supply lines running in from the Middle East. But the number of jobs is kind of murky. There's supposed to be thousands and thousands of jobs, but there are no hard numbers. There were hard numbers with the French. It ran in the tens of thousands of extra jobs. And that was a matter of great contention along the way. It was one of the arguments that was thrown up against the French, is that they were going to get more jobs than we were. It was like a football game. It was like, you know, they were getting more goals than Australia was. The whole notion of this agreement with the French was one of strategic interest. So it was actually president to prime minister. It was a government to government thing. And the jobs were going to be integrated, learning how to use this technology, how to use this, what they call low enriched uranium technology, which is nowhere near as dangerous as the stuff that the Americans use in their submarines, this highly enriched uranium, which is extremely dangerous and can be used to make atomic weapons, and is a great matter of concern to the Non-Proliferation Treaty supervisors who, the IAEA, are really worried about how to actually get this through, because on the question of, firstly, jobs, you've got the problem of it's completely, it's a myriad of numbers that mean nothing. There's no guarantee because we can't build nuclear submarines in Australia. We don't have the capability. Not ones included, not ones that use highly enriched uranium. On the other hand, you've got the highly enriched uranium, which has got to be disposed of as well at the end of the cycle, which is in, seeing as we're getting secondhand submarines, they run 25, 35 years, probably the next 20 years or so. What are you going to do with it? Where's it going to go? And that's America's great problem, excuse me, is where they put their highly enriched uranium, the Yucca Mountain. That thing has fallen through because of a number of legal challenges. Australia, same thing. There were Aboriginal land rights issues, and the plan for a dump in South Australia, I recollect, was overturned. So what we do with this stuff is a matter of great national importance. But it wasn't something that concerned Scott Morrison at the time. All he was interested in doing was appeasing his right wing, who wants to be close to America, and wedging Labour. A simpleton's political handbook is what he operates by. Not that he's a simpleton. He's extremely devious and very, very clever, but he's also very, very dangerous because he appealed to the simpletons. And consequently, his idea was to wedge Labour, to terrify them that if in the election the following year, which was after the announcement of AUKUS in 2021, so 2022 April, that he was saying, you either go with America, if you don't go with America, you're anti-American. Very bad thing in Australia to be accused of being anti-American. The fact you may be pro-Australian is beside the point. And the other thing was really on the issue of nuclear power, and he tied those two together so you could bring nuclear power into Australia as well as being close to the United States. And bringing nuclear power in was really important because it's part of the shibboleth of the Liberal Party, that nuclear power is good because the Greens don't like it. So it's seen as being a way of attacking the left, attacking the Greens, because of the problems that are inherent in nuclear weapons and all the rest of it. And Australia's been what they would notionally call a nuclear-free country, although that also is a nonsense. But politically, it's seen as being a nuclear-free country. So he wedges Labor on those two issues, and he did very well at it because Labor just completely caved in and went for close to America and also accepting nuclear power, which now we see up and running an argument based on nuclear energy and nuclear power. So it's a seamless transition.
How did losing or cutting off the French deal represent a turning away from Australian sovereignty and independence from the US? I mean, it seems pretty obvious, but I liked the way you described it.
Sure. I mean, I think the point is that when you look at these things overall, and you try and you look at the defence acquisition on one side, and you look at the overarching picture of things, and you see the things that are being said in the backdrop. For example, it was a government to government, right, plan. So France and Australia. Now, the Americans would look at that and see France and Australia and say, well, where are we in this? Okay. Macron came to Sydney and he talked about a tripartite France, Australia, India agreement. There was no mention of America. He talked of the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road, anathema to the United States. He talked of dealing with Peking, as he called it, as the French call it, Peking, and being, and then dealing with problems and not confronting them, anathema to the United States. On top of this, you had Malcolm Turnbull, who was the co-chair of the Republican Party, a Republican movement in Australia, wanted Australia to be a republic, very much a centrist in political terms in Australia, and somebody who prided Australia's independence. He wanted an independent, totally separate from the Crown. So these things come together. The United States sees a country moving away from their influence as they see it, because although it would only be a smallish thing, you have to be on bended knee to the United States if you're part of their control zone. And Australia was actually getting off its knees, and this was not to be tolerated. And so France had to be removed from the equation. And that's, I believe, what they did.
It's incredible. And then also I'd like you to just talk briefly about Australia's role in escalations between the US and China in space, which you went into in this book as well, and the risk for the sparking of a nuclear war, the initial strike of a nuclear war that starts in space, actually.
Yeah, I mean, you have to just look at the reason that Australia does these things, and why do we have these ground-based communication systems that can communicate with nuclear submarines way under the sea? Why are they in Australia? What role do they play? What role do we have in actually saying whether or not they can be used to launch a first strike against China? And the answer is, we don't. All the ideas that somehow we are concurrently involved in strategic matters with the United States, we have no right to stop that transmission. It would be physically impossible. You have to shut the station down to stop it. So that's one of the arguments that you can run, that Australia has already really lost a lot of its sovereignty. On the question of space-based attacks, we have a system that was transported 250 tons. I seem to recollect a parabolic telescope that can see deep into space. And it was sold to Australia as being something that was actually about stopping space junk and things like that, and protecting Australia from things that might be fired at us from satellites. In fact, it's all about the strategic capabilities of the United States to run a first strike if it wants to, if it deems it's necessary. And how do we know the United States would even consider a first nuclear strike on another country? Because they haven't ruled it out. They have not ruled out, even in a conventional war, using nuclear weapons, whereas China has. China has said they will never do it. And they just reasserted that I think they said it first in the 60s, and now they just recently reasserted the fact that they won't use nuclear weapons first. Now, whether or not China's to be, sort of accepted, whether you accept the word of China, I mean, I'd be skeptical of any promises that are made. But I'm particularly skeptical of people who don't say that they won't use it. I mean, it looks to me like you're setting up for a first strike capability, and that's what I see in those two areas that the Americans are doing.
Andrew, let me switch gears a little bit and ask you about the process of writing this book. Who did you want to interview and refused to speak to you?
I wasn't refused to speaking to anybody. You know, but what I did, Joe, in doing this book, what was difficult about it was to actually talk to people in the right order. So you had to talk in a way that would not close doors around you. So I made a decision to take everything on the public record and to go through everything on the public record. And then that was a chronology, which is a classic way of obviously doing research and writing a book. And then to actually make my way in towards the middle. Now, I think by doing that, I was actually able to talk to people who wouldn't normally have talked to me. If I'd have been going to, as you have to, a long way out from publication date, you have to go to people like Morrison, you have to go to Abbott, you have to go to those people on the inside of this treacherous deal, all the doors shut like a concertina coming out towards you. So I spoke to people and didn't want to frighten the horses, and I got more information that way. I mean, it did aggrieve me to a certain extent. I wasn't able to ask Morrison, how he managed to sleep well at night, since he's put the country in such a parlous state. But that sort of egotistical journalist in me, I had to put to one side. I had to say, he'll have his say, he can speak afterwards. He's got a big microphone, he can say what he wants when he wants to say it. But if I go to him at any time before publication, they will run interference against the book, which, by the way, they did do. Exactly what happened. I trusted a newspaper with an excerpt from the book. It was a newspaper on the other side of politics, on the right side of politics, but I wanted to get it into that domain. It's my belief that they gave information from that excerpt, that 2,000-word excerpt, to Morrison and allowed him to have his say, because they published a denial of something that I was exposing in the book. They published it before it was published. So, that's what I think is a problem. That's why I handled it the way I did.
That must have been the Australian where you used to work, is that right?
No, it wasn't the Australian. I mean, look, I have certain problem talking about this, and I'm being as frank as I can with you, and it's nothing to do with really me. It's somebody else, and I just don't want to I don't want to.
Can you tell us what it was that he denied, that you revealed?
Yeah, he denied the whole business of his deception of Macron. Yeah, he went through that thing saying that he'd been warned and all that. Macron had been warned, and he clearly hadn't. I mean, if what Morrison said, which was, he said that he told Macron, this is many different stories that he came out with. He couldn't keep up with the lies he was telling. At one time, he said in Glasgow that he had told Macron that conventionally powered submarines, the French conventionally powered submarines, were not fit for purpose. And and so he said that was it. Like I warned him. Now, if that was the case, well, the French will say, well, our submarines aren't fit for purpose. That's it. That's the end of the deal. Clearly, he didn't say that. Clearly, he misled him into believing that France was still in the race, because that's part of his argument. If I told the French that they were out, they would have created a hullabaloo and looked around to see what we were doing. It's better in text if you go through it in text, but it's just another example of deception. This guy Morrison is extremely capable politician, and he's quite a brilliant operator. But the problem is he trips over his own fibs. That's what happens to him. He gets caught up in it all, and he's still doing it. I mean, same old stuff.
I imagine the French were eager to talk to you.
Yeah, the French were as you say, they were much easier to talk to. And although some of them would talk to me off the record, this thing burnt a hole in France. It was the biggest single acquisition program they'd ever had, and in the history of the Republic. And they were delighted by it. In fact, it was Australia was flavour of the month or flavour of the 6 months or 2 years. And the way it was done, the way that Australia knifed France was unbelievable. I mean, I just think the French are still, and I've talked to some of the French military, and they're still wondering what they didn't understand, how they could be so comprehensively lied to, and how they could miss it. I think the other thing is, how did we miss this? Well, I think that the problem the French have is that that they were a bit naive, I think, to actually trust Morrison. And my advice would be to people, and if you're going to deal with the government, don't deal with the government, deal with the person. I mean, it was, the number of waypoints along the way where there were red flags that the French should have picked up were legion. For example, the French ambassador to Australia was denied free access to Parliament. All the other Five Eyes countries, strategic partners, have an open access to Parliament. The French ambassador tried to get one, and he was denied it. He tried to contact Morrison's office, couldn't get through there. Maurice Payne, foreign minister, pushed back. Now, if that's happening when you've got a major agreement and you're getting absolutely terrible press coverage, which they were getting, which was leaking out of the Prime Minister's office in particular, because he ran this campaign, I would have thought the French might have been thinking, what's going on here? And pushed into it a bit more deeply. They did in the end bring in a guy who was very capable, called Kim Gillis, and he'd worked for Lockheed, so he'd worked for Boeing in the past, and he'd worked in the government and acquisitions, and he actually sorted out a lot of these minor little details about how to actually boost the number of Australian jobs and money spent in Australia, all this sort of stuff, and fixed it completely. But it was never about that. It was only about finding an argument to get rid of the French.
They must have seen this as Anglo-Saxon arrogance of the highest order.
When you talk about politics and defence acquisitions, let's get this straight. I mean, defence acquisitions is bent. I mean, it's a corrupt process. It's riven with grifters and con men and crooks and all the rest of it. I mean, absolutely trough feeders. So when it comes to actually being straight and honest and all the rest of it, I mean, I think that nobody really expects it, right? You expect it to be bent. So let's try and the French are particularly good at paying people off and getting their stuff in there. But this was actually not about France. It was really about Australia, and it was about how Australia was so deceived by its own leadership. The Australian Parliament was kept out of this, right? Many of the ministers were kept out of this. Half the Defence Department, if not more, was kept out of it. They ran a secret cell inside Defence to run this thing against the French. They never once considered using the French submarines, even when it was put up as a way of using nuclear technology, low enriched uranium, less dangerous than the American high enriched uranium. When this was put up, I was told just a few days ago, a senior member of the Navy said to the people that were looking at what kind of nuclear submarines we're going to get after Morrison had directed them, he said, what about the French? And the guy said, the Americans would never allow us to have French nuclear submarines. Don't look at them. And I've seen the FOI statement, which kind of bears that out. They're just looking at the Americans and the British. They don't look at the French. So it's like, this is a problem of acquisition. This is a problem of, regardless of whether or not it's about nuclear, this or that, this is no way to run a country where you have a secret spend, where you have a secret cell running in defence, you shut the cabinet out, you shut the half Defence Department out, you shut the Australian public out, and the lower chamber and the Senate out of this stuff. You're not honest in this process. And it's important because if we do it once, we'll do it again. If we do it again, it may be even worse. Lack of transparency.
How could they expect Parliament to allocate this money if they weren't involved in the process of approving it?
Didn't have to worry about that. They didn't even tell Treasury. They just hijacked the whole thing and rammed it through. just the bulldozer effect, just put it through, and with no opposition from Labour. That was it. Senior Labour minister after the election said, "How do we get out of this?" Well, they didn't do anything about getting out of it. They set up an inquiry, which basically sort of, in a mumble jumbled sort of way, just sort of underwrote it and said press ahead. We just ended up with no submarines, a huge bill, and a loss of what would have been really interesting, and if you want to be nuclear, interesting nuclear technology that may have benefited the country and may have benefited the industry in Australia. On top of that, we became even closer to the Americans, so that if they go completely crazy and start a war, well, we're in it anyway, but we'll be even more in it now. It's truly a disaster for Australia.
Is there no constitutional method for Parliament to overturn this deal?
I imagine the Parliament could overturn it. I imagine the Parliament could just pull the plug on it in the national interest. I mean, I don't know what the contract says, because we don't know what the contract says. It's secret. Like the ministries that Morrison had when he was Prime Minister, secret ministries. We got a secret contract because it's all covered by national security, which is mainly a nonsense. Mainly the national security covers hiding information from the public, not from the opponents, because I'm sure the Chinese know more about what's going on in Australia than the Australian public does. But to go to your point, if there were to be a minority government or a coalition government in the future in this country, it might be possible to pull the plug on this, yes. I personally think that there should be some kind of inquiry, if not a police inquiry, or a corruption inquiry, although I'm not suggesting direct corruption, but a corrupt process, or there would have been a Senate inquiry. But of course, the Labour and Liberal parties are in lockstep on this, and that was the beauty of Morrison's deception. He wedged Labour, and then Labour itself was wedged internally, because Labour was split internally by this. So it's greatly problematic for the democratic process, and also for the Australian people who've got to pick up the tab for this, and end up with a process which is a bad matrix for the future if anybody else decides to go down this path.
There's a thing that happens here in the U.S. quite often, that a party that's in power that has a certain position is reversed when a new party takes over. And then when that first party comes back in, they don't do anything. They leave it the way it is. I'll give you examples. Trump recognized the Golan Heights as being annexed by Israel. That was not something any government had ever done before in the U.S. He reversed the Iran nuclear deal. And he reversed Obama's diplomatic opening to Cuba. When Biden got in, he didn't change any of that. He accepted the Golan Heights thing. He didn't do anything about the nuclear deal, and he didn't do anything to try to reestablish. So I think we see the same process here. We see what Morrison was up to, but what is Albanese's excuse here? Why is he continuing? And you wrote very harshly about Labour. Quote, I'm quoting you, Labour lost the one chance it had to identify itself as independent and courageous and put the interests of the country ahead of its understandable desire to win government. The consequences of the fear that drove the Australian Labour Party leadership to embrace AUKUS with barely a second thought will haunt them for years to come.
Yep, that's right. I wrote that.
Can you elaborate? Why couldn't they say, well, wait a minute? That's Morrison's deal. They don't have the courage to do that.
I wrote that, and I kind of think it's self-explanatory. But I mean, I think that it was possible that Labour could have stood up and said no. Labour didn't follow the line on Iraq. Of course, the French paid a price for that, by the way, still do. The line on Iraq. That was one of the things that came up repeatedly during discussions when inside the Defence Department, it's like, can't trust the French. They weren't with the Americans in Iraq. Well, Australia was, but Labour wasn't. I mean, that's the thing. You can stand up and you can still be, inside the American orbit. But the craven fear, just the fear of Whitlam, the fear of of the Americans cutting off information, which they do at times, for a variety of reasons. They decide that Australia is not safe, needs to be punished, so they cut off the flow of high quality intelligence. So Australia just fears that, and my view is that there are people in the Labour Party who obviously understood it was possible to stand up to the United States, but I don't think Anthony Albanese really had the understanding of how it was possible to do that, and he just wanted to win. He just wanted to win government at all costs. Well, the problem with winning government at all costs is that there is no such thing as at all costs. You know, the cost is much higher, and he's paying it now. I think it's seen as being, it was a weak decision which got him elected, and it's a weak decision that will haunt them for a long time. Not to say that Labour hasn't done good things along the way. It certainly has. It's done a lot of good work, but this is a symptom of that that failure to stand by what they stand for. If they don't stand by what they stand for, the others will walk all over you. And you can see Dutton doing quite well in the polls and saying these rather extreme and simplistic things about the economy and about power.
Dutton being the leader of the opposition, the Liberal Party, National Party. He's with the National Party, and
No, Liberal Party.
he's liberal. Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned Gough Whitlam. The prime minister was overthrown by the CIA in Buckingham Palace in the mid-1970s, which haunts every prime minister since then, that if they actually stand up to the United States. It's interesting you bring up Iraq, because I was having a conversation with someone in Europe today. I was saying that the only thing that could save us really from ongoing disaster with Russia is if the Europeans go their own way, become independent of both US and Russia, and be a third force there and assert their own dignity and sovereignty and independence against the United States, because this war with Ukraine has destroyed the German economy, essentially. They went against their own interests just to do what the Americans want. And I have no idea why Europe continues to be slave to their master in Washington. Do you have an idea?
Look, I must say I've followed the Ukrainian, European response and NATO's response and America's influence. There is no doubt that America has great influence over European policy. Of course, one of the countries that it doesn't have so much power over is France. And that, again, comes back full circle to the whole issue of French, like nuclear strike force that's separate. They don't have nuclear weapons outside their country, have an independent policy. I mean, of course, they take French intelligence out of Africa and everywhere else, because the Americans have got great intelligence gathering. It's what they do with it sometimes that's the problem. But that's why France was, again, a problem. The whole of Europe and Germany, I mean, I really don't understand what's going on in Germany. I don't understand, this whole issue of being so close to the United States. But of course, it was the United States that the Germans see as being the country that through the Marshall Plan, got them off their knees and rebuilt the country. So there's a certain sentiment there. And I think you've got to bear in mind, although, Joe, we talk very often about facts and figures and all sorts of strategically important things, the sentiment that people have about things is often far more important than the fact.
That's 80 years ago, Andrew. I mean, that's still, Australians are still indebted to the US for saving them at Darwin, where the British basically said, screw off, right? So at one point you have to assert.
What point don't you understand about sentiment? It's something that parties work for all their lives, to shift the sentiment, to shift the idea, to shift the vibe, you might want to call it, whatever it is. Because not everybody's deeply involved in politics and in the nuances of this and that and everything else. It's like they feel this thing. And in this country, in Australia, the Americans saved Australia. Now, it's not exactly true. In fact, it's not true at all. But that's the narrative. That narrative has been won by as Keating has called them, the Austro-Americans.
I'm suggesting that after 8 decades, that sentiment starts to fade. I mean, the French saved the American Revolution against Britain, but people aren't going around here in the U.S., still indebted to the French because of that. So, but that's okay. That's more than 80 years. But in any case, I want to read this passage from Secret Country by John Pilger, the late John Pilger, who who died a year ago on the 30th of December. He wrote this about Australia. I think it's so apt to what we're discussing.
Yeah.
He wrote, Australia still has not gained true independence, as the historical record shows. We Australians remain one of the most profoundly colonized of peoples, and Australian sovereignty the goal of dreamers, a goal which other, usually poorer countries have achieved after struggle and bloodshed. It is a melancholy irony that Australians, proportionate to their numbers, have shed more battlefield blood than most, and that so much of this sacrifice has not been in the cause of independence, but in the service of an imperial master. The Australian is to fight other people's wars against those with whom Australians have no quarrel and offer no threat of invasion. That was written in 1989. It could have been written today about China.
Absolutely. I think Pilger's absolutely right about that. He writes very, very clearly and very well about Australia. He understands and has explained as a good journalist to people who don't maybe read the details of Defense Department reports exactly what our role has been, and that's exactly what our role has been. Nothing's changed, as you say, Joe. It's as true today as it was back in 1982. The question of the sentiment, the US sentiment, is changing. It's still there. It still is an important political consideration, and that's what Albanese, I think, got wrong. I think actually he could have tapped into it and shifted the dial. I think people would have come with him, but he's stuck with the old order, the old thinking. There is a sentiment that shifts to a more independent Australia, but it's easily, can I say, scared, frightened off. I mean, Australians can be easily frightened, and probably he was frightened of Dutton, what Dutton might say, and then we would be back to where we were, back in Whitlam's day, back before we even talked about the Republic.
Let me ask you about the reaction to the book. What is the reviews, reactions in France, here in Australia, if any in the US? What you're laughing. I was going to ask you what disappointed.
Well, it's great. No, it's good. It's a lovely question. Thank you for asking it. Look, I couldn't. If I'd have written the reviews myself, I couldn't have written any better reviews. I mean, they were extraordinary. I've written a few books, and this is the book that just touched something in Australia and also in France too, but particularly in Australia. And it was like people were saying things like, well, one person, a professor of history, Marilyn Lake, said, this is a book that every Australian citizen must read. I thought that was absolutely a wonderful thing to say. People were saying that it actually explained to them the complexity of AUKUS, but also the context in which it existed, which they hadn't understood before. And it gave them a clear, and this is the thing that I really liked more than anything else to be applauded for, was clarity of prose. And the clarity of prose was the thing that I thought was very significant for me as a journalist, because I think our role as journalists is to make complexity clear, and it takes a long time and a lot of work to sometimes get into the clarity of material. But that is the role of a journalist to do that, and to pay me that accolade is the highest accolade I can possibly receive. Clarity of complexity.
Right.
And in France, they said, they reported it as a major sort of. It was like 2 years after the event. They're reporting it as though like this is still breaking news in France. In fact, it's coming out in France in June in a French edition, because it so touches them and how they see themselves in the world and how they operate, and what it means to be dealing with a country that can be so deceptive. I think for me, when you didn't really understand what was going on. I mean, the French diplomacy is pretty good, but they really got caught with their pants down here, and what happened. And they wanted to know the detail, and the detail's there for them to read. It's not all good news for them. I mean, they made some mistakes, and there were problems in the Elysee, but this is a distillation of how their foreign policy didn't work.
Has there been no French journalist to write the French version in a book?
There were no French journalists writing anything like this. No, none at all.
You're the only man alive who has actually taken the time to explore a massively important story. I mean, there's so many parts to this thing about sovereignty, French independence, as well as Australian and the whole nuclear deal and the dangers of the nuclear waste and whether the enriched uranium that will come in an American nuclear sub is actually can be legally permitted on the soil of Australia. We didn't really talk about that. Will it violate the NPT, which Australia is a party to, of course?
You know, I mean, books fall into two major categories, in my opinion. One are the sort of really detailed academic books that are read by academics, and books that are written by journalists very often that are more or less sort of, you know, ripping reads, light reads about, you know, a drama and catastrophe. And I think that this book actually was in that mid range, which is kind of dangerous because you can be seen as being too academic, or you know, you're not actually, it's not popular enough. You know, there's no sex in this book. You know, it's like it's not a cheap read, but it reads like, as someone did say, it reads like a page-turning thriller. So, but I had the time to do that, Joe. I had the time to do that, and journalists, working journalists, certainly don't have time to do that because they're on the treadmill. And if you want to make, you know, a big hit around the world, you know, writing about defense acquisitions is not exactly going to make you #1 New York Times bestseller, unless it's about America. So it was an Australian book about Australia and about France, and those are the two countries that are really hooked into this. Not so much the UK. I mean, you know, it's not so important in the United Kingdom, although I think it should be, because this was all part of what's his name, Johnson's shtick to say, you know, we're now a global power and we're going to be selling submarines to Australia and all this sort of stuff. In fact, I did say that Morrison was the Boris Johnson of the Indo-Pacific, which I thought was not a bad phrase. So you got these, you know, I mean, it didn't get that hook into the UK. It certainly got some press coverage, and it will be published in France in French. But it's done well here. It's done much better than Melbourne University Press, the commissioning editor, Nathan Hollier, thought it would when I first pitched it to him. And he was courageous because he thought this is an important book, but very often important books, you know, sell 5 copies. This is an important book, and he thought it was really worth doing to expose what was there. And I did it, and it's been extremely well received, and it's selling well. We're on second reprint, so it's doing well, and I'm pleased with that.
Well, that has to show the Australian public is not pleased with this deal, and they want to know why it happened the way it did.
Absolutely. I mean, AUKUS is really on the nose with the public. I think the opinion polls show that as well. But you know, it's like it's always after the Lord Mayor's show. You know, it's like what you pick up afterwards. And you know, we have to go to another iteration of Parliament, and maybe there'll be a minority government, maybe it'll be overthrown. But in the meantime, there's this huge gap in Australia's defences, and a real mishmash of being caught up with very dangerous, highly enriched uranium. You open the door to nuclear power with Dutton. You know, all these things flow from this really crass, deceptive, dishonourable action by the former Prime Minister.
What about Labour's reaction? Have you heard anything back? Any channels from the Labour, from the government?
Well, the people in the Labour Party really love it. I mean, they absolutely think it's fantastic. But Labour has issued no statement on this book, and no journalist, from what I can see, has asked any direct questions of the government in a news conference ever. And there are a number of questions about the lying that was done, the deception, the disaster, you know, the role of these submarines. What are they for? What are they for? Why do we need things twice the size of the old ones that can stay under sea for as long as the crew can manage to get by on the food they've got? Why do we need these things? It's because they are to fight a war with China. They're not about defending Australia at all. These questions are just too deep to ask at a press conference, unfortunately. They should be, but they're not.
Did you break news in this book that they could have asked about?
Yeah, well, I mean, Morrison, the lies he told to Macron was one. It was plainly revealed for all to see. I think that the other story about the role of the head of national intelligence and what he did and what he wrote and what he said absolutely reveals his role and his anti-French move, his anti-French sentiments, and he was the person who signed the deal. These are the important questions to ask. They're not sort of road crash questions, but they're questions of accountability to the government. So those are the things you hold them up against. I mean, has anybody spoken about the cabinet ministers talking about how do we get out of this deal? Just ask the question. Just ask the question. You're not going to get, I mean, Elbow's not going to say yes or no. He will refuse to answer it, but he needs to be pressed. You need to press on these things. The trouble is going for the grab, which is what it always is in today's news world, is counterproductive to journalism very often. Just to ask the question and see the stumble, to see the look is important. But the trouble is that the AUKUS deal was accepted by the media, and there was no pushback against it. There's been no pushing back against the costings. How did we get to the costings? How was this thing costed? How was it ever costed? We don't know. There's no costing. Why wasn't Treasury told about it? Treasury wasn't even told about it. Why weren't the French considered for a nuclear submarine? Why not? Why not? These are the questions. But it was as though we'd done the deal, we move on, that 24-hour news cycle, that's gone, now we go on to the next thing. Now it's nuclear power stations, and we just move on from one thing to another, one day after another. It's the crisis that journalism's in. So I don't necessarily blame the journalists, but I do think they could have had just a little bit of fun now and again and poked the government just once or twice with a couple of hard questions.
I'm turning it over to Elizabeth again.
Sure. So I wanted to ask as well, how far along, just for the sake of our audience, how far along was the French deal when it was reneged on by Australia? And how much money is Australia having to pay back to the French because of the cancellation of that deal?
Yeah, they paid back 850 million for the cancellation. The steel would have been cut in 2000, last year at least, starting to build the submarines last year, and they would have been in service, the first one, say 2030, in whatever it is, 6 years' time. As it is, it's a lot later than that with the Virginia class. The interesting thing, by the way, about the steel is that it's French steel. Now, French steel apparently is the best in the world for nuclear submarine hulls because of the pressures they need to contain. And when I first read this, I thought, this is French propaganda. This going saying French steel is the best. Of course it is. It turns out that the British submarines are built with French steel because they had this special system that they used to create it. And Australia was given access to that particular process, that process of creating steel, and they still have the idea. They still have the secret process, secret remedy to make the best steel. I think they're not allowed to use it, but it was at that level France was sharing its intellectual property rights. And maybe I can just tell you a story which kind of gives you some idea of the way in which the French were trusting about this deal. There's a guy called David Gould who was the Undersecretary for Defence in the UK, and he's an acclaimed expert on nuclear technology, submarine acquisitions, and counterterrorism and all that sort of stuff. He was employed in the early days by Australia to look at the submarine program. He's a guy who said, look, can't make up your mind, write out the questions, pick the three that win, and then pick the winner from that one. And they called him back in 2016, before they made the announcement, before Turnbull made the announcement, and said, which one's the winner? And he said, well, which one have you chosen? He said, well, the French. So he said, you're spot on. The French by far the best. He went to the Defence Department and they said, well, hang on, they've chosen the French, but the French, they won't let us have access to all their intellectual property. They're keeping it secret. And he said, well, yeah, it's secret technology, Gould said, because, you know, that it's the quietest submarine, it's the best, you've by far got the best. And they said, but the Germans would give us all their intellectual property. They give us everything. And Gould said to them, well, why do you think they would do that? It's because their IP isn't worth anything. That's why they're giving it to you. You've got the best deal here. And he said to me, as we were having a white bread sandwich up at the Army and Navy headquarters or club in Pall Mall in London, he said, I got the feeling that the Australians wanted to take the French technology and then piss them off to steal it. And he said, he used an expletive to tell him what he said, like, get on with it. And but that was at that level that you got that sort of, it was like venal, it was completely commercial. And what the French said, and what Gould said, was this sort of idea that this was a transaction. It was a transactional relationship. The French saw it as an overarching sort of strategic relationship, make France great again, if you like, Indo-Pacific, not going too well in the Pacific at the moment, but that was the idea. And they were going to share everything and teach Australia about things. But the Australians wanted to just say, get the lowest price, we want that, we don't, we want everything. It's like, it was a complete mismatch, and it was stirred up and used by Morrison to get what he wanted, which was go with America and wedge Labour.
And how much effort was put into this deal through the entities like the Naval Group? If you could describe that for our audience a little bit, and the work they were doing between France and Australia.
Well, they did a lot of work. I mean, this was during COVID as well, by the way, when things were running rough, and the Australians were asking for a guarantee of a spend in Australia. I think they wanted 60% of the spend. Well, this was not in the contract, but they were so concerned about, the bad press they were getting, that all the money is being spent in France, it's not being spent here. And part of the agreement that the Naval Group had with the Australian government was that they wouldn't speak out. They were restrained from making any public statements. So things got so bad that press got so bad, critical of the French, saying that all the jobs are going to France and not to Australia, that the head of Naval Group, in the middle of COVID, went out to Charles de Gaulle, caught the 24-hour flight over here, spent 2 weeks in quarantine in a hotel, and tried to see the Prime Minister to talk about these issues for this huge, huge deal, and couldn't see him. Eventually saw some minor minion in defence. I think it was defence anyway, yeah, in government, and got short shrift. So I went back to Paris. They had put a lot of effort into this. I mean, this just wasn't just flogging submarines. It was actually about building a strategic alliance in the South Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And of course, that was the very thing that horrified the Americans. If anybody should have been secret about this, it should have been the French. The French should have been secret about the alliance they were building with Australia because of the fear of being knifed by the Americans. So it was completely the reverse. And I'm not really very fond of arms manufacturers. It's not really my deal. But I saw the failure of due process being so problematic for the Australian people that this became it was an example of a failure of due process and deception, which just happened to be about arms acquisitions, and it could have been about anything else. But when you get to that level where governments and executive government can overreach and pass round all the normal processes of government, which, by the way, Penny Wong so expertly revealed in a Senate inquiry before Labour won the election. She couldn't go against the Nuked deal, but she could say, what's the process? She just completely unpicked it. And you can see the way that they just bypassed all due process and did the deal, which is very dangerous for a democracy. And we now see what executive overreach means. I think that you certainly see it in the United States. And we are in danger of walking down a similar road if we're not careful, if we're not vigilant, I think.
Back to you, Joe.
Are there any grown-ups in this story? I mean, it just seems the behavior is so extraordinary. Of
Well,
people in responsible positions.
I mean, look, there are people who are grown-ups and they say, and this is Kim Gillis, who used to be with Boeing acquisitions, defence acquisitions, and he used to be in the acquisitions side of Parliament in the Defence Department. And he said that he's been a public servant, and he said he always spoke out against what he saw as being a failure of due process. And this was a failure of due process, and he said it should have been stopped. The problem is that the public service is so coward, so fearful of speaking. It's one of the reasons I would have had trouble talking about peeling the onion, coming in from the outside, being careful who you talk to, because the fear of people speaking and telling you even the minor detailed point, which gives you links you to the bigger picture, is so endemic in the public service that that they daren't speak out, and they daren't speak out even inside the department, because they're seen as going against what the national government wants, and that's the kiss of death. In fact, what Gillis wants, and what Gillis said he wanted, it's in the book. He says we need to have public service protection. Whistleblowers need to be protected. Hugh White, who strangely enough interviewed me, and he's somebody I've interviewed many times, as he's a defence. He was former DepSec for Defence a few years ago, and he interviewed me at a book show, and he said to me, 20, 30 years ago, the head of defence would have gone to the Prime Minister and said, you can't do this. You can't do this. It's not right. It's not due process. We've got to go through due process. It's got to be accounted for. The threat, what our response to it is, and the costing. We can't just go this secret deal. Now, that didn't happen this time. In fact, the head of defence was out there warning about war in 2025 and basically doing the government's business for them, which is not what I think the role of the head of the Defence Department should be. I mean, it's not to say it's illegal, but it's certainly not what's historically been the role of the head of the ADF.
Your story is about the degradation of processes, of norms, how government works, this defense official saying 30 years ago they would have done it more or less in a proper way. People still felt they had a conscience, that they're supposed to do it. They had some responsibility to the public. That seems to be all gone, not just in this story, but your story makes this pretty clear, I think. And that's very, very disturbing.
Oh, absolutely it is. They people feel that they have to do as they're told, because we've broken the trust. We've broken the old lines of community spirit, of community responsibility, of any kind of communitarianism, all individuals on individual contracts. It's the great supply side economic nonsense we know so much about, and here it is in micro form. There are people running on short-term contracts. The head of the Defence Department, they're rotational, maybe it's every 5 years or so. But you get a good 5 years, you can even get renewed. Okay, in the old days, it used to be tenure went on forever. Not a good thing. But what we've got now is so fractured, and the individuals are so fractured inside those departments, nobody will give frank and fearless advice, except people that have retired and are on a public pension, and they can speak their minds. But the government can just ignore that. There has to be a system where public servants are protected when they speak about a breach of due process, and they can talk to the Senate or the House of Reps or Committee of Intelligence and Security and Cabinet. Those people, if you like, but in some way there has to be a pressure valve release here, because otherwise we're going to make these same mistakes again. And this is not my view. It is my view alone. It's not only my view, it's other people I've spoken to in the public service.
Andrew, thank you so much for the time. I want to, if you don't mind another few minutes, I want to bring Kathy. Kathy, he has a few questions for you.
Sure.
Hi,
Thank you.
Andrew.
Sure.
And congratulations on your Walkley Award for Nuked.
Thanks.
Look, Australia is a signatory to the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty.
Yeah.
Also, we haven't a clue what to do with the storage of high-grade uranium waste. Could either of these two things put a spanner in the works in this project being taken forward? And secondly, in terms of storing this nuclear waste, if we have to do it, are we not putting Australians in danger, at extreme risk for possibly thousands of years to come?
Yeah, I mean, the whole issue of storing uranium, high-grade uranium waste has plagued America and the UK for decades. I mean, they've got a number of submarines still tied up at the wharf that have been out of commission now for about 20 years, and they can't move them because the reactors are full of highly enriched uranium, bomb-grade uranium, and they don't know what, but they can't shift it. The Americans had the same problem because they got shut out of a reprocessing or a dump plan in the Yucca Mountains. Same thing in Australia. Where are we going to store this stuff? It's extremely toxic, extremely dangerous, and its half-life is hundreds of thousands of years. So that is a fundamental problem. The other problem with highly enriched uranium is that, yes, you can have it in your nuclear submarines. Yes, you can have it there. Australia is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the problem is that if Australia can have nuclear, highly enriched uranium in its nuclear submarines that it owns, the problem is then so can other countries. And at the moment, that hasn't happened. Signatories to the NPT don't have highly enriched uranium-powered nuclear submarines. So Iran is just sitting there and has publicly stated that if Australia gets it, why can't we? It causes a proliferation problem, and it's a proliferation of nuclear weapons problem. And that's what worries the NPT. And that's why they're wringing their hands. And that's why you haven't seen the head of the IAEA coming out and saying anything clear about what they're going to do about this issue. So it's a really huge problem. It's one of the things that Biden looked at in the early days was the NPT. They were worried about it, but not worried enough not to suck Australia into their containment of China policy. So it's a good question, and again, shrouded in mystique and secrecy. I'll just say one thing about nuclear matters that I picked up along the way, and that is that some nuclear weapons were stored in the Netherlands during the Cold War. And although the Netherlands was a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and should not have had those weapons on its soil, what it did was it ceded that soil and those storage areas to the sovereign rights of the United States. So that's how they got around the NPT problem. So what I want is a discussion about this. I want this thing to be discussed about what we're doing, where we stand on the issue of, do we go to war over China or not? Do we go to war over Taiwan? I mean, what is our position on that? Oh, it's going to be ambiguous, we're told. We need to know what is our stand on nuclear weapons, the storage of nuclear weapons in Australia. It's no good having B-52s, H model B-52s capable of carrying nuclear weapons, the standoff bombs that they can use. They will have to be stored in Australia in the event of an upcoming war with China. So where are these discussions? What are we talking about? What are our promises? What are our secret promises to the United States? These are the kind of questions which aren't being asked. And these are the kind of questions that we need to have answered. Malcolm Turnbull, when I interviewed him, said, if we're storing nuclear weapons in Australia, the public has a right to know. Now, we know that America brings its nuclear weapons through Australian ports because it's not banned even under our South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Agreement, the big hole that was cut in it by Bob Hawke to allow us to be a nuclear-free country, but to allow the Americans to bring their nuclear weapons through. But so we need to be honest with the Australian public. But the problem is neither party is being honest with the Australian public. And I just think that other journalists should join in, and they seem to be more now. I mean, AUKUS has been under a lot of pressure recently, so it's underway now, and I just support any journalists who want to push the envelope and expose information that the governments want kept secret.
Yeah, and finally, one of our prime ministers that hasn't been mentioned today is Malcolm Fraser, who wrote the book Dangerous Allies. It was about America being a dangerous ally and us really not having the law behind us to be engaging in these foreign wars, that we could be taken to The Hague. America had the Patriot Act, but we didn't. We were just going along as a junior partner. Would you agree with Malcolm Fraser that the United States is a dangerous ally for Australia?
I think it goes without saying that you need to choose your allies very carefully, and be very careful when you trigger the AUKUS Act, the act which says that America won't come to our aid and we won't go to their aid. Although, of course, John Howard triggered it after 9/11. I think that America, at the moment, particularly with the current administration coming in next year, is extremely dangerous. I think that Trump is extremely incompetent, and that's his biggest problem. Is that he may not want to start a war, but he may start a war without understanding what he was doing. Whereas in the past, America started wars because it wanted to. I think that we are an integral part of the American warfighting machine. Pine Gap, Northwest Cape, the large parabolic telescopes, and all the other stuff that we're now hooked into around the country. And I think that if America got involved in a war with China, we would inevitably be caught up in it. What sort of response we'd get from China, whether they would strike back at Australian ports, Australian intelligence installations like Pine Gap, is unclear. Whether it would go nuclear or not is unclear. I mean, certainly the United States is more likely, according to its public statements, to go nuclear if it was under threat. It's an extremely dangerous time. And our role, from what we can see, with the interoperability rather, of our forces now, from interchangeability, we've now moved to interoperability, means that we are one and the same thing as America's military. So if they're in it, we'll be in it. That makes them a very dangerous ally, because we are unlikely to start a war with China. America is likely to start a war with China.
Yes. Thank you very much, Andrew.
No, thanks, Kath.
Yes, we learned what the American attitude was to their junior partners in AUKUS when Mr. Biden introduced the Prime Minister of Australia during the AUKUS presentation as that fellow down under, if you remember. He couldn't remember Morrison's name. It was the press conference where they announced AUKUS. It was the joint press conference with Johnson, Morrison, and Biden. Let me end this, Andrew, by asking you to try to look forward. How is this story going to end? Will Australia ever get these submarines? Will they ever use them? Can it be stopped? You know all the players and you know the issue. How do you see this going?
It doesn't matter to the Americans whether Australia gets the submarines or not. As Kurt Campbell said, they won't be lost to us. They'll be ours anyway. Yet we've already paid over $5 billion to the United States to help grease the slipway to speed up their production, because they can't make enough submarines to reach their target of 66 to contain China. So if they can't reach their target to contain China, they're not going to sell Australia 3 or up to 5 nuclear submarines, because it'll be taking away from their capability, which they can't reach at the moment. So it's an impossible situation to be in. And for the Americans, it doesn't matter. They're already getting money from Australia to help fund their shipbuilding program. And we've got no guarantee we're going to get submarines at all, because the president may decide it's not in the interest that they're given over. And even if they are given over, we can't operate them by ourselves. So this is
This is piracy on the high seas by the United States.
well, I mean,
they're stealing money from Australia as if they need it. I mean, the dominance that they have, they're able to just tell Australia to do whatever they want them to do. It's humiliating.
oh, it's humiliating. I think it's humiliation brought on by people who want to be captured. It's like, actually what they didn't understand was, I think the power relationship shifted a bit. Instead of, why do you think America decided to come in and give Australia what it wanted, what Morrison wanted? It wasn't because America wanted to help Australia. It's because America thought it was in its best interests. And its best interests were to get Australia hooked into this. Hey, and to pay all this money in with no guarantee that you're going to get anything back. What a great deal. At one time, Kurt Campbell, I think it was, raised the question, do you really think that Australia can fund this submarine project? Now, that would have set off alarm bells among, the simplest of simpletons. It's like going in to buy a nice big car in the showrooms, and the showroom guy says to you, it's very expensive. Do you think you can afford it? I mean, it's complete nonsense. The Americans actually were worried that we might kind of pull out and not shovel the money their way. What we didn't understand was actually they wanted us in. The power balance of kind of, the desirability balance had shifted. We were spending our whole time pulling them close to us, and here they were pulling us close to them. Well, that was a negotiating position. It was a lever, but it was never used, because our negotiators were only about doing one thing, getting close to America and wedging labor. That kind of simple, stupid negotiated position. Wasn't a negotiated position. It was just about giving Morrison what he wanted. Whatever Morrison wanted to win an election. It's truly shocking to bring it down to that level.
It certainly is. By the way, Kurt Campbell is currently the Deputy Secretary of State of the U.S., and he was the Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs when he was having this role that Andrew's referred to several times. Yeah, it comes down to winning an election. The interest of one individual in Australia has caused this enormous deficit for Australia, this unbelievable. If we're going to survive, to me, it's the countries that act as vassals to the U.S. that they depend on, Europe, Australia, Japan, have to, maybe not Japan, but they have to stand up and chart their own courses and claim sovereignty while maintaining good relations with everyone. Okay? Not cut off the U.S., but have good relations with China, with Russia, and the United States. There's no reason why. Certainly Europe can do this.
Well, I was tempted to say that the elephant in the room here, when we're talking about Australia's prospective deficit, that it's absolutely nothing compared to America's. I mean, the elephant in the room is over $35 trillion of debt. And one could be cynical and just think that, well, they want money. They want money from us. We've got money. And they've given us a terrible deal. We might not even get the submarines. And then we don't get our money back. I mean, it's outrageous.
And you've had to spend money saying sorry to the French for,
Yeah.
on top of it.
Believe me, I need counselling after writing this book. I needed counselling. It was so depressing.
Yeah. Reading it was easy to read. Like you said, it was clear, but it was depressing.
I kept my sense of humour, because my partner in crime has got a good sense of humour.
What's important, Andrew, is that it has won this important award, and there are a lot of people reading it.
There are, yeah. There are.
That's important. That's counselling enough.
That's right. Yeah. What could possibly
maybe get Australians to stand up and demand sovereignty.
Well, yeah, I know. Look, they can't even give the Aboriginal people any bloody due recognition. They get so terrified. I mean, they just, it's one less lot can cross the road by themselves. They need someone to hold their hand. Honestly, that's depressing. That it's like the voice was just Oh yeah, anyway, that. It's just depressing. Yeah. Anyway, good.
What, the deal itself, or that it didn't pass? The voice.
The voice didn't pass. I mean, it didn't pass, and these Dutton's arguments and this sort of scaremongering and all. I mean, it's just,
Neanderthal. It was a Neanderthal argument. But it wasn't such a great thing. It didn't go far enough, the voice, but couldn't even get that passed.
You know what? I'd accept anything. I mean, I'm a pretty, I'm a pretty low rent negotiator. I would have accepted just the first step. Once you step over that line, everything can move forward. Taking a hard line on stuff is all very well, but I think that you need to sometimes just make that step and then go, and then you go, well, we've done that. Just like you said about Biden and the Golan Heights and all that sort of shit. Once you do it, it's never undone. And for a variety of reasons. Anyway, Joe, it's always a pleasure talking to you.
Okay, Andrew. All the best.
Elizabeth. Okay.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Next year marks our 30th anniversary since Consortium News was founded in 1995 by the late investigative reporter Robert Parry. We have big plans for our 30th year, and we want you to help us accomplish our goals in 2025. So if you haven't already, please make a donation today to our 2024 fund drive. Thank you.